Uno. All right, welcome to another episode of The Brown Perspective. This is your host, Romero, and I'm here with my co host, Eduardo.
¿Cómo estamos?
Bien, bien. Crazy week.
Sí, aquí con el corazón todavía partido, con la mente encendida y listo y preparado para seguir este proceso digamos, de procesamiento, ¿no? De trying
Mm-hmm.
to understand and figure out everything that I've been feeling, that I felt for a long time, but everything that's going on too. So looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, it's been 3 nights now. I think 3 nights of protests, which have now turned to rioting.
Mm-hmm.
And even this morning, I was on Twitter, and then I was checking the headlines, and it's spreading to multiple cities.
Mm-hmm.
You have so many narratives out there. Depending on which part of the internet you want to go into, you're going to find a different narrative for who's behind this, what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You go from you're just crazy out there, right? So we're going to try to cover this from our point of view, from our perspective, what we're seeing, how we feel about this, and trying to understand this situation from other people's perspectives too, and trying to maybe put some try to gain some understanding as to the bigger forces at play here, because there's so many, there's so way too many variables here to try to pin this down on just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think so far? How did you feel when you saw this video?
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw it, it was just heart wrenching, right? Because you see, you see, okay, this person's on the ground, and at this point, you only see two cops. There's the white cop who has his knee on his neck, and then there's a Asian American, I believe, Hmong um, cop that is sort of keeping the people who started filming and are protesting.
Mm-hmm.
And as you see that develop, you think, oh man, like at some point he's gonna lift his knee up, right? Like he's you see him struggling, like he's subdued. And I think from the first video, I didn't realize there were two other cops on the other side of the car also holding him down. So at this point, it just becomes, you realize that he's not posing any danger to you. Let him breathe. You have
Yeah.
him under control. Let him breathe. And you almost also see when, like, the more that the bystanders are complaining, you kind of see him also like double down.
Yeah.
So
Like
it's
he's
almost
enjoying
becoming
it.
like a personal thing, like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm in control, I'm
Yeah.
the law, and I get to do what I want. I don't listen to you. So is this, it is brutality, right? You see the brutality, and because it's a, a police officer, somebody who's supposed to enforce, somebody who's supposed to protect and defend. When you see that happening, I think that's why there's this. Um, and I know Trevor Noah and others have sort of talked about it, but it's like you realize how broken the contract is, right? How, like, the law is only being enforced and being enforced unfriendly and indifferently for some people, right? And particularly in going back to the previous conversations that we had, when you saw white people protesting with guns, and you see the different way that those two groups of people are treated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just a combination of that, people being at home for over 2 months, and also kind of getting antsy. So there's a lot of pent up energy, a lot of pent up rage, sadness, uncertainty. So I think that's one of the reasons why it feels like this is a critical moment. It feels like a 1968 almost, like 60s type of stuff that's going on.
But what's also crazy about this is, in addition to everything you said, is that this happens all the time. This is just
Yeah.
a cop got filmed doing it, but this has happened this year before, last year,
Hmm.
10 years ago, 20 years ago. And before, they used to get away with this because it wasn't recorded.
Hmm.
But you see how comfortable he is asserting his dominance, and you see
Hmm.
how he is defiant of the crowd that's telling him to let him go. and he seems to be enjoying it. Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say enjoying it, but he's definitely defiant and kind of trying to prove a point
And angry too,
that
right?
he's in
Like there's a
control.
something of anger that comes out of that.
Yeah. And so the I think a lot of Americans who in the past would have dismissed this as the police are only acting within their legal rights to defend themselves against these thugs, right? Keyword thug.
Yeah, you get into the messaging and wording.
Yeah,
Words
exactly.
matter too.
So in the past, whereas a lot of people would have been able to look at this and say, okay, the guy had it coming, so nothing to see here. The system's working as expected. I can go back to my little bubble
Hmm.
and pretend that this type of thing doesn't happen. They don't have a lot of answers in this case because, as you pointed out, regardless of what may have happened before, because initially the guy was, I'm sorry, George Floyd was parked outside of a store, and there had been a call to the police because someone had said that there was somebody that was trying to pass off like a counterfeit check, or I'm not sure if it was counterfeit check or counterfeit money.
Hmm.
I read that a few days ago, but at this point, they don't even cover that anymore in the news. And
Yeah.
what they haven't really, I haven't even read. I'm sure it's somewhere in there, but I haven't even read if George Floyd was the primary suspect or if he just happened to be there. But regardless of all of that, though, when the video starts rolling, it's pretty clear that he's not resisting. And they
Hmm.
already have him handcuffed. And then there's three officers on top of him. So the guy has his knee on the neck for what is it, like more than 7 minutes?
Yeah.
And of because when in the past when police officers have shot, especially black men, there's always this process that the nation goes through where it divides into sides.
Hmm.
And there's always a side that tries to justify it by saying that they shouldn't have been resisting, they shouldn't have done this, and that. Can't say that in this case. And
Hmm.
I think people need to understand that the the line the line between a cop being a protector versus being an oppressor is very small, and it's actually very blurry when it comes to people that live in the inner city, people of low socioeconomic status, especially African Americans. And it's always been like that. But people have always been able to pretend like it's not, at least a segment of the population, not everyone.
Hmm.
And I say people of low socioeconomic status, people in poverty, because the police officers do um, behave this way, not just with blacks. They have a disdain, it seems, for people that are generally poor. And so they do kill other whites, they do kill Hispanics, they do kill blacks. It just happens to be that they seem to have higher disdain for black people, right? Who also at a lot of the times happen to be the ones that are poor. And I'm still reading the I'm still reading Twitter. I'm still seeing how the whole narrative shapes up. But so far, at least, that's what I've been seeing. That for the first time, a lot of people, even the conservative ones, are at least calling out this cop and saying, "Yeah, this is total. This is murder."
Yeah. And I think to go back to your point, so a couple of things. One, I think that also appreciating that being a cop is a hard job and that there are good cops out there, and that as people, we do turn to cops when we feel something's going on, when we feel unsafe. So I think acknowledging that there are also a lot of good cops out there who are protecting their lives, who, and it's a tough job, right? Because you go out as a cop and you don't know what to expect. It could be an easy day or it could be something bad. So I think also acknowledging the humanity of the cops and also acknowledging that not all of them are bad and that there are some of them who either have something mentally, so many issues that I'm sure they carry, because cops are people too, so they represent the spectrum. So just acknowledging that. And then the other piece was, as you talked about the circumstances, I think what's maddening is that you realize that there's a whole system, structural reason why things are the way that they are. So black people are not poor just because they want to be poor or because they don't want to work hard. I mean, there's been historical circumstances that have oppressed black people, that have oppressed Native Americans, and also in talking about people, native people from across Latin America. So that's the thing, and I know this gets to a lot of the topic that the podcast that you shared with me was um, is just acknowledging that there's a reason why there's so much injustice and inequality, so much suffering in our societies and our cities, and that there needs to be an acknowledgement of that, and also like how do we address it? How do we make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that people have more equal access to opportunity and life and liberty, right?
Yeah, yeah, and what you said there about the cops, also the cops that don't behave this way, whatever the percentages may be of these type of cops that are out there that are power hungry, that want to make a statement, that they won't back down, that they instigate instead of de-escalating. However small that percentage may be, at the end of the day, they're still protected.
Yeah.
They get protected because of all these internal reviews, and those that are not like that, maybe for whatever reason they don't speak up. Maybe if they do speak up, maybe some report gets filed, but then it gets buried. So then you end up with a guy like this cop that has, what is it, 12 prior complaints against him,
Yeah, and that's a problem. The fact that he had so many, nothing had happened. I mean,
right?
that shows a breakdown in the
Of
system.
excessive, of using excessive force. And I think the problem is that, again, these cops get protected because they're given the benefit of the doubt. Because a
Yeah.
lot of the times when they've done this before, they get away with it because there's no one watching. And whatever
Hmm.
story comes out, it's their story, and it's their story that's believed. I mean, just imagine if this incident hadn't been recorded, and George Floyd would have died just the way that he did. So now what narrative comes out? Well, we got a call for a suspect. He was resisting arrest, so we had to use force, but it was still within like the legal type of force that we can use, because believe it or not, in that particular city, putting your knee against somebody's neck is considered okay as an acceptable form of restraining someone.
Hmm.
It doesn't say to keep it there even after somebody has the handcuffs on. That's excessive. But if you need to put your knee on someone's neck just to initially restrain them, it allows you to do that. So these cops would have just said that. You know, we restrained them, we put our knee on his neck, he resisted for a while, eventually he stopped resisting, and then the ambulance came and they took him off and he died. And these cops would have walked free. And I grew up in LA in the early 90s. I
Not
know.
not just anywhere in LA. Tell where you grew up.
Yeah, yeah, in South Central LA. And I remember during the riots in 19, was it 1992, 1991, 1992. Let me just double check that because it's been a while. Yeah, 1992. They burned down the liquor store right behind the apartments where we lived, and I
Wow.
remember all the looting and everything else. And it's not just, it's personal in the sense that we've grown up around this since the 90s because we were here in the epicenter of one of those big
Hmm.
flare-ups. But
The Rodney King, right?
I have family members who have gone through this as well, who have been mistreated by the cops, who have ended up getting into fights with police officers. I mean,
Hmm.
thankfully they weren't shot, but um, my even my own brother once, he was pulled over, just probably a routine pullover profiling, right? See if this guy, he looks dark skinned. Let's see if he is uh, if he's up to no good, whatever. So they pulled him over. He had his daughter in the car with him. She must have been like 4 or 5 at the time.
Mm.
They took him out of the car. They put him in handcuffs, And then
Wow.
they put him behind in the car, in the police car. And the whole time he's saying, can you please not put me in handcuffs in front of my daughter? What are you doing? I haven't done anything. Just what?
Mm.
And you can imagine my brother did what a lot of people always say when it is that the cops do something like that to you. Everyone always says, well, just comply,
Yeah.
and then you'll be okay. Like nothing will happen. Well, my brother, apart from having to see his daughter, see him in that situation, he's pleading with the cops, asking him what he's done wrong, not to do that in front of his daughter, and to give him an explanation, and they're not doing it. Dude, like how many people can keep their cool in a situation like that?
Not many is dehumanizing.
And he did, right? But afterwards, he felt so like deflated,
Yeah,
so
violated.
powerless. Yeah, it's a violation of your dignity, and then you have to
Hmm.
live with that for a while. I don't know if he's over. I'm sure at some point you kind of forget about it, but
No, it's traumatic.
that was a one time thing for him. I mean, we've had other. I mean, I was pulled over when I was younger too, like a few times. And like, but see, that's the reality of people that live in the hood, in the
Hmm.
city. That
Over policing, right?
yeah, that when you see somebody finally snap, you're not seeing them snap because that happened once. You're seeing them snap because that has happened to them over and over and over, where it was the cops that were instigating. And if it didn't happen to them, it happened to someone that they knew. So that they
Yeah.
have lost complete confidence of the police system that's supposed to be protecting them. So if you've lost complete, if to you policing is no longer, or what policing represents, if it's no longer legitimized to you because of how unfairly they treat you and your community, then can anyone be surprised when after so much instigating people finally do snap, and then as a result of that they get killed and then they get blamed, right? So it's like the a bully constantly picking on a kid until the kid finally gets enough courage to stand up to himself, and then the bully just beats the crap out of him, and then
Yeah,
blames the
but
kid for starting the fight or for something, right?
yeah, but I think the Rodney King incident provides a very important, a good example. So it's almost like history is repeating itself. And will this time justice be served? Because even though the Rodney King video, there was a video, and you saw the excessive way that they beat him, those police officers were still acquitted, and that's what led to the rage that led to the LA riots and riots in other parts, but particularly here in LA. So in some ways, like what's happening now is almost a reaction to that, because you have a video that beyond a reasonable doubt shows that excessive force was used. So what kind of punishment is the officer going to get? Is he going to be let off easy, or is he going to get like a punishment that is equal to the offense that he did, which was to kill an innocent man in excessive use of force? And in some ways, there's this fear that justice is not going to be served. That there were riots before before the trial, but also I think it just gets to the visceral nature of what happened. Like you see that that's just wrong. Like that cop, yes, he was fired right away, but he should have been arrested, or it took he's arrested now, and I think people are feeling that that justice is being served, but there's also this all these indignities that people have suffered and witnessed, and that finally the world is exposed to them. Like that's why I feel that this is such a critical moment right now.
Yeah, well, he has been charged with third degree murder, and I could see how charging him for first degree is difficult, because I think first degree means it's premeditated,
Hmm.
as opposed to this one, which is excessive use of force. But I think somebody can make the argument that the cop didn't intend to kill him,
Hmm.
but he was reckless in his use of force, and reckless in enforcing or taking advantage of his authority. And the cop, pretty sure that right now life has been turned upside down, and he, like we said earlier, probably done this before dozens of
Hmm.
times to others, never been caught. And now the report came up that is suggesting that there aren't any signs of asphyxiation
Hmm.
that caused the death. That there may have been other existing conditions that, when put
Hmm.
under that stress that he was put under, that factored in. Um, and so yeah, so that's gonna go to the courts and they're gonna figure out what happened, but it's still murder because if anything, a police officer should have some training to know that if these days people in their 40s walking around, there's so many conditions, diabetes, heart conditions, high blood pressure, whatever it is,
Hmm.
and to be so reckless in the way that you enforce the law, and to have this disdain for life, or not for other human beings, to the point where you sit on somebody for 7 minutes, man. That's I remember in you know what that feels like in elementary school, the way that kids used to fight each other, that rage of somebody just pinning somebody down and putting their foot on their face and just holding it there.
Yeah.
I saw that once in elementary school. There's this kid named Eddie fighting another poor kid named Anthony, and he had him on the floor, his foot on his head, holding it down, and wouldn't let him get up, embarrassing him, asserting his power. That's
Yeah.
man, and what is really hitting people hard with this one is not only was he not resisting, but his last words were to his dead mother
Yeah.
twice. I think I heard twice. And there's just, but like with everything else, it's gonna get attention, and people who are not ready to be honest with themselves are gonna find a way to close the door on this without doing any like type of self introspection and self growth, so that they can become better people. And you can
I
already
think but it's going to be less people though. I feel like given
it's a yeah it's
how
a
visceral the reaction has been, I think some people will certainly still have that, but I think there's been a lot more people that need to now process this
it's a
shit.
very gradual process, and you're already starting to see the narrative taking a different shaping up in a different direction, because the protests have turned to riots now. And unfortunately, because there's no way to control a mob, not necessarily a
Hmm.
mob, but a group of people, like groups of people have their own, in a way it's like an organism that
Without
that
lethal force.
yeah, but protesters, it's an organism that seems to, not one individual's calling the shots, but
Hmm.
it has a mind of its own.
It does.
But at the same time, because it's a group, it's so easy to steer that group in a specific direction, to
Hmm.
infiltrate it, to even make it do things that will immediately discredit that movement. So I've been hearing a lot of narratives. Maybe I'll ask you your take on what's going on with the peaceful protests now escalating to full out rioting. Now, is that organic? Is that the small element of people that will inevitably try to exploit a situation, will exploit this to loot stores
Hmm.
and so forth? But is that all that's going on here, or are we seeing infiltrators, provocateurs that are coming in there knowing exactly what it is they need to do to incite a crowd towards to escalate the violence, the looting? Did you see the video? There was a video that is very sketchy, and it's somebody caught somebody in all black with a cap or a hoodie and a mask, the mask that has the vent on the side,
Yeah.
and then like orange ones. So it's one of those.
Professional one.
Yeah,
So
the
they're thinking
mask.
that he's a cop. Yeah.
Right, you've seen it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's a cop or not, but what is very suspicious is how he's just very walking very casually with a hammer, breaking windows, and then when a black guy confronts him to say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Like just because he seems out of place, it seems like what he's doing is he's obviously trying to do something
Yeah,
to
not
escalate,
what they wanted to do. Yeah.
and then he walks away. If if
Mm.
if if you're protesting for someone's cause, if you're with them in solidarity, first of all, you don't just okay, fine. Even if you could be in solidarity with the protesters and you can break some windows, but when they confront you, are you going to just walk away, or are you going to at least try to say, "Hey, man, like I'm outraged that this happened. I just want to
Yeah,
blowing
no,
off
you
some
defend your
steam."
actions.
Whatever, right? This guy just left because he's not part of the protest. He's there.
Hmm.
He has different motives, and it's hard to understand what the motives are, but it's easy at least to see that those are different motives than what the protesters have. And this is a perfect situation where there's so many ways to influence this. There's so many ways to shape the narrative. There's is this at some point you get to the point where you don't even know what the truth behind it is. Is it all
Hmm.
organic? Is it just people being frustrated and they're starting to burn things down, or is there some manipulation going in there? And the reason why I say it's so hard to get into it because without without any hard evidence, all that you have left is speculation. And
Hmm.
once you get into the realm of speculation, it's like people go crazy. They go off the hinges. They start blaming whatever boogeyman, whatever monster they think that is secretly pulling the strings on society. They'll go anywhere without any proof, just because it sounds like that could have been that group or that person. But yeah,
Yeah,
what do
no.
you make of that?
So no, so I think it's interesting because it definitely happens, right? So the scenario you're describing, the infiltration, I think I can definitely see how a separate movement says, you know what, they're hangry, let's make them break some windows and now make them look like criminals that are rooting. So I do think that that's possible, and I think would, given what's going on, it is definitely something that can happen, and it does happen, and even happens within other groups who now want to jump in, and maybe even just regular people who say, hey, there's protests going on, I've been hungry, I need stuff, let's go steal something because we're desperate, we lost our job, we don't know what's going to happen, this is our opportunity to get some stuff that we can either have for ourselves, sell, and get by. So there's that piece of it. But I think the other lens that we need to talk about, and which I think directly led to what's happening now, are the tweets from the president, and the fact that he used language from back in the 60s, when the looting begins, the shooting starts, right? And I think that now you add this political lens and his motivation to get reelected and to get his people involved. So I think in some ways, maybe some one of his followers did what you just said and say, "Hey, this is our opportunity to discredit this movement, make him look bad, and make him lose the political support that they need to bring about the change that's so necessary." So I think that's one of the reasons why Mahatma Gandhi, why Martin Luther King knew that the only way that you can make change is through peaceful demonstration, because the violence and all that is coming from the states, not from the people defending themselves or for some other party. So I think that's why nonviolence is the only way to go, because like you minimize the reasons for excuses, and for using deadly force and all those things. So I think those are some of the reflections that come to mind for me.
Yeah, and if you just look at the motivations behind it, like who would stand to benefit from manipulating the protests in any way? And they mentioned that this guy that walked around with the hammer breaking the windows, that there's a picture side by side of him as a cop. It could be him. It's hard to say. It's pictures. That's the problem. It's inconclusive. It's very likely. It looks like him, but there's no you can't be 100% certain.
Hmm.
But is there a motivation? Is there an incentive for the police officers to escalate? There might be, because that might be part of the way to fizzle out a protest, also to
Hmm.
escalate it so that you can then come in and use more force.
Yep.
And then you essentially you stop it. You use some force initially and you stop it, because otherwise it could spread through to other cities, to other towns, and so forth. So that's one strategy that the cops, because we do know that the cops use infiltrators, because there's been documented evidence of the infiltrators when the water protectors were protesting that pipeline that was going to
Mm.
go through the Dakotas, and there were peaceful protesters, but all of a sudden these guys would show up, and then they would start asking questions like, hey guys, so what's going on? Hey, so who's in charge here? Like,
Mm.
which one of you guys are in charge? And like asking all these questions, like, if but pretending to be part of the movement, but then asking questions. But then these would be the same people that you would see then. I think it was somebody that had a gun or that was shooting, and he was outed as like, this is guy, like, it's an outsider, it's an infiltrator. And in this particular case, also the um, didn't the police just say this morning that a lot of the arrests that they made in the last 2 days, at least yesterday, a lot of those were from outsiders. It
Mm.
wasn't people from the city. So again, if there are outsiders coming in, is that just because they're anarchists? Is that because they just want to see chaos?
Yeah.
Oh, well, there's people like that, but that's the problem that we get into with this situation. That not only are rioters and crowds so easy to control, but the observers themselves, us people, it's so easy to manipulate them as well. And and so you take something that's happening, and now you take these guys that go on YouTube, and like the Alex Jones types that are spouting all of these like senseless things that are getting people aroused and angry. And next thing you know, it's like people fighting on Twitter and stuff based on there not being any concrete evidence of anything. And
Yeah.
so it just gets into a really, really difficult area. But unfortunately, what it does is it discredits the protesters. It takes away from the focus from their cause, and now uh, people start uh, rioting and looters, and then you start seeing that language again, that
Hmm.
language that the establishment uses to describe these people, like thugs. Let them destroy their own neighborhood. Like, nobody ever even talks about why it is that some of that the people, even if it is just the rioters, even if it's just the protesters that progress naturally to rioting, and they're the ones that are burning down the businesses in their neighborhood. Nobody ever talks about the conditions in the neighborhood that would actually lead to somebody wanting to burn the businesses there. And one of those
Yeah.
such factors is that, well, those businesses aren't even from people from the hood a lot of the times. It's outsiders that come into the neighborhood, they set up businesses, and they take the money to other communities. So
Hmm.
people in the hood, they rent, maybe they own homes, but the percentage of business ownership is usually low. So they don't have any attachment to the businesses because it's not even theirs. They feel disconnected. Even within their own neighborhoods, surrounded by poverty, they feel disconnected, and they vent the frustrations. Yeah.
That's true. And then the other piece is that there are segregated communities where a lot of opportunity has been taken away, you know, through redlining, to other discriminatory practices, to underinvestment in infrastructure, more importantly, disinvestment in education. So I think that all of those factors just come to the surface, and I think that's, in some ways, it's, it's kind of like that movie Hunger Games. It's almost like we're watching, and it's not a game, of course, but it's like, to your point, that there's this, as a society too, we're having a conversation with each other. And like you said, I think that there is a mob mentality, and that somehow, some way, like a group of people can start thinking in a very particular way. But this is an opportunity as a whole society to have a dialogue with ourselves and say, okay, why is this happening? And understand that these are the factors, these are some of the things, that the root causes of this. So if we don't address, um, this investments in these communities, giving them job training, all the inequities that are now even more apparent because of the pandemic. Like if we don't address this, this is going to be a reality. And do we really want to live like this? Like, do we want to live like our country can be on flames at any minute, or do we want to like address the issues so we can make it happen? And within that, obviously, you have the movements, and then you have the political parties leading up to a presidential election, which is probably one of the most consequential elections that we can be having now, right? Because it's either 4 more years of Trump or perhaps a new presidency with Biden. And it will be interesting to see. I mean, and some would argue that regardless of who wins, the system stays in place. That's true. But I think that it seems like with their Democrats in power, at least there's more of an effort to try to address some of the root causes of the problems that we're experiencing now as a society.
Well, I'm not total. You know how I feel about the Democrats. I'm not totally convinced that they're any better on so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
They What Trump is saying on Twitter is that's how he feels, and we know that he is a racist.
Mm-hmm.
That he's one of those guys that doesn't really care as much to try to hide it. But that doesn't mean that Joe Biden is not biased and there's no racism in him. He just won't, he'll never tell you. But you've seen the gaffes. Have you seen the gaff
Mm-hmm.
where he says something about, in inner city neighborhoods, there's no reason why these poor black and brown kids can be as smart as a white guy.
Mm.
So when he puts his guard down, he gives you an insight into how he feels. Trump is saying it, and like we've said it a million times, the guy's an idiot. He's just not. But it doesn't mean that he's any different than a lot of these other people. A lot of these other people feel that way, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why these things keep on happening anyway. That's why it's so hard to. That's why it's so hard to change the system, and why it moves at a snail's pace is because the system is made of people. Like, we can sit here and blame the police officers all we want, but look, if we were actually raising a generation of kids that were not racist, did not discriminate based on color or even class, you would get rid of, like, all of the problems in the police department would be solved within like 20 or 30 years when the old guys retired and the new ones came in. But what happens is new ones come in, and then they've already been indoctrinated before, or they get indoctrinated in the police force into that system, and they don't have the tools. If they haven't been indoctrinated into like racially profiling and having a bias against blacks, and they get into the system, that's where they may get indoctrinated, and they don't have the capacity or the tools to be able to say, nah, this is BS, I'm not going to go along with this way of thinking. So it's people that
Mm-hmm.
perpetuate the system. It's all of us. And that, I think that's what's most frustrating, that you hear me often talk a lot about people being self-aware and being honest with themselves. And it's so easy to go on Twitter and start uh, telling these protesters how it is that they should protest. It's so easy to get on Twitter and yell at others for being racist or for doing all these things, but there's not a lot of people that actually look inward to see how it is that we are the part of the problem, even me and you to
Mm-hmm.
some extent, right?
Yeah.
And let me, I want to try something different today. I want to try something new because I really want to try to see if we can deconstruct some of these very complex topics. And I'm gonna do a little bit of a drawing, and then we can go along. But before I do that, we were talking about this in the beginning. This is El Negro Tomás from a comedy sketch show in Mexico from the 90s, probably late 80s, 90s. It was named La Cosa, and they used to do a blackface making fun of a black guy. And you can see right here, right away, right? You could see that this is a light-skinned Mexican making fun of, or at least doing skits based on the stereotypes that he grew up with of black people.
Yeah.
And these are very similar stereotypes that I picked up or that somebody put into me when I was a kid in Mexico. And it's not nice, man. It's not pretty, the stuff that you learn as a kid. And if you're not honest with yourself that these are the things that you learned and these are the things that you may actually still be carrying with you, these like unconscious biases that you have. If you can't be honest with yourself about them, then you won't recognize them and you may actually act out on them without even realizing it. And so the reason why I bring up this show is because I used to watch it as a kid because the adults around me used to watch it and we thought it was hilarious, right? Um, but before I get into what I want to talk about, any comments on this show? Because I know that this probably hits close to home as well from you being from Colombia.
Yeah, and no, it definitely does. And I think I recognize the actor, and I even though it was the same show, I think we had similar shows in Colombia that not only denigrated African people but also natives. So like usually over there in Colombia, like the native indigenous people, they live in the departamento de Pasto, so they call pastusos, and usually the portrayals of the native people from there were like, oh, they were dumb, they were making these stupid comments and things like that. So there was negative, negative comments and stereotypes about Indian people and African people too, because in Colombia, the native people tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the country. That's same thing as people from the African diaspora. So it's interesting because this portrayal, and for me, it's interesting because in some ways in Latin America, we like to say, oh, since we've been part of this colonization process, since we've mixed our races, since we have mestizo people, racism doesn't exist in Latin America, or it's different, and it does exist, and it's racism, classism, and to your point, like a lot of us are still coping with that and understanding, and I think we've gotten a lot better, but I think there's still so much more that we need to learn and do to regress some of the evils from the past. And I know you want to get to your exercise, but for me, like so much of this of race relations, when you think about it, is the result of the American continent, of the colonization experience and trauma that we experienced as a continent, and understanding that a lot of those biases came from Europe and other parts of the world to and impacted how we treat each other and how we see each other's humanities.
Right, right. And don't worry, there'll be plenty of time to talk. As I'm essentially trying to portray some of the things that we visualize in our head when we talk about this, because I think it helps to put it out there and to be able to see it and focus on it. And when you mentioned about the biases coming from Europe, and that's key here because it's the ideas that take hold. People are the same no matter where they come from. Like they have the same flaws, they have the same type of characteristics. Like people that put up these artificial walls between somebody and somebody else based on their skin color, it's silly. And the sooner they grow out of that, the sooner they can actually start becoming better contributors to society or focusing on other things, because that's just like people just need to get out of that at some point. But the flaws are the same. But once you insert an idea into an entire group of people and it takes hold, it is incredibly difficult for that idea to essentially to stop existing within the
Yep.
people, even as you go through generations. And this is all intertwined in this issue with police brutality. And I read a lot about from the conservative. I read Zero Hedge because I want to see what the other side's saying. I want to see what someone like Alex Jones is saying. Conservatives, right wing, liberals, because it's important to see what they're saying, because we shouldn't be afraid of like listening to them.
Hmm.
After all, they do have a right to free speech, But what I do find hear a lot is sometimes the claim that police officers, that it's no longer an issue about race, that police officers kill as many whites or close to as many whites as they do blacks and Hispanics, and so it's a problem with police, with the police abusing their power. And you see this a lot. You see this a lot in arguments on the internet and with people where, for some reason, they're unable to arrive at a place where they realize that it's a little bit of both. Like it always has to be one or the other. Mm-hmm. Like it's police brutality. Race is no longer an issue. That's one extreme. Whereas others will just say race is the only issue. It's like, no, it's both. You have police brutality and you have a percentage of them or a portion of them that are driven by race. But at the end of the day, it does seem to affect African Americans a lot more than it does the other general population, even if the general population is also subjected to the abuse of cops. Mm-hmm. Sorry. And so what I wanted to do was, I wanted to first draw the hierarchy that we're also accustomed to coming from good old Latin America, right? The hierarchy of value, of how valuable you are, of how likely it is that you're going to be successful. What is another word that I'm looking for here? The desire of the families to mix the genes with others, the acceptability. So
the privilege.
Yeah, the privilege. Mestizos. Am I spelling that right? I hope so.
Yeah.
So we have something like mestizos, and this is generalized because the point that I want to make is that Native, or I'll put not Native Americans because that's more of a North American term.
First Nations.
Yeah, indigenous people. So they usually put them somewhere here on the chart, and then you have and then way at the bottom, no matter where you go, I'll put the blacks, because that's, in my head, that's how they say it when people say it. No matter what culture you go to, there are many cultures, Asian, Filipinos, whites, Latino-Americanos. This is the hierarchy that they have been taught. Europeans, good. Somewhere in there it's Asian, but for our purposes, Asian is not as important. Whether or not Asians are like at the same level with Europeans from a Latin American's point of view, right? But I'll put them somewhere down here, I guess, because they're also somewhere up there. Okay, so you have that. So this is the hierarchy of privilege, as you said. The thing with blacks is that people that want to make the claim that we no longer live in a racist society is that they're oversimplifying things. I don't know if it's intellectual dishonesty, if they're just being lazy, or if it's just ignorance and they don't have the right people around them to actually explain it to them. But part of the reason why I want to make this exercise is because I want to try to illustrate just how hard it is. First of all, how hard it is to prove that racism exists, but also how hard it is, or how easy it is to show that it still exists. So the reason why I drew this diagram here is because at the very bottom, you've always find black people. And that's what came from the Europeans. That's the idea that came because they brought them as slaves. They took them away from their country, from their continent. Their transplants here in the United States. They strip away their culture. They put them into slavery. They don't give them an education. And even once they get the freedom, there's so many laws, institutionalized practices that keep them down. And so the idea that kids from Latin America grow up with, that blacks, essentially it's one word. And this is, to me, I'm always trying to understand the root cause of something. Like, what's the root? don't show me a statistic that you dug up out of somewhere that says that cops are more likely to kill whites as blacks because of blah blah blah. Because statistical, depending on how you do the study, it can always be portrayed in a certain way. Don't give me statistics, even though we have a lot of statistics that show that there is discrimination. For example, uh, police killing is one of them. Again, whether or not you want to see the studies that show it, or whether or not we have studies that actually show it. What about the one where if you have a black name and you send out a resume, and if you just change the name and it's a white sounding name, you're more likely to get a phone call from the employer, right? What about getting a loan from a bank, and the banks historically discriminating, not letting black people into certain neighborhoods, not giving them loans because they consider them higher risk, or again because of racist policies. So the idea that I want to really try to decompose here is the idea of inferiority, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's before I get into this part right here. Any I'll stop to get your take so far on this.
No, yeah, I think that it's helpful to understand that, and I think even within a lot of these groups, there is discrimination, like who looks fair skinned, who looks more indigenous, who can pass and who cannot pass. So, and obviously a lot of it is race, and then a lot of that racism and classism, well, resulted in classism as well. So it's also a matter of economics and culture too. And then there's it's and I think and the colonization process in the United States was a slightly different than what happened in the United States that happened in Latin America, but still a lot of the same factors at play. And then and yet, well, let's continue with
Yeah, yeah.
where we wanted to go.
Yeah, so the reason why I want to focus on this idea that blacks are inferior is because I think, just based on my upbringing, based on my interactions with Asian Americans, white Americans, even other, not black people actually as many, but mestizos, Mexicans, Latinos, all of them. At some point or another, nobody will ever admit this in these days, but I have heard people say, oh, they're not as smart. Oh, they're more prone to violence. Oh, they're not capable of building great civilizations or a functioning society. Look at Africa. Mm-hmm. You hear these comments and they give you an insight, and they allow you to see that in some point or another, some people still hold this idea. Because I think at the root, and by the way, this is just one interpretation, that there could be many, but this is just one way of looking at it. So let's begin with the idea that blacks are inferior. See, this leads into a lot of other ideas. One is not as smart. That's one. Latinos and in Latin America, they have this. It's pervasive. That's part of the discrimination. The other one is let's see.
They're violent.
Yeah, but that's really like more primitive. If we want to just get behind the idea that people have in their heads about what it is that's happening, and then the other one could be something like, just a second here. It takes a while. That's why.
Actually, you're pretty fast.
Not capable of building, creating prosperous. Right. You hear this a lot with people that point to Africa, and they point how poor it is. I'm trying to expand this. Let me see if I can expand the canvas. Let me zoom out. So that's the size of it. Okay. I have this already. Let me remove this so I can move everything to the top. So we already have this chart here that we drew out in the beginning. Let me just move this front and center. So not as smart. And I'll just put a few more, like two more, and then we'll get to the conversation. So something like not as smart, more primitive, something like this is what leads directly to attitudes that say something like, what the hell? Yeah. If you go here, then you need something like needs tougher enforcement, or they require tougher enforcement. They require tougher enforcement, and actually, the not as smart one can also be used as a justification for that. They're not as smart. On the other hand, you could have not as smart leading to someone saying that's why they need something like affirmative action. And then this one right here, more primitive. That one has a lot of repercussions because people start saying something like, that's why they're burning down their neighborhood.
Rioting.
Yeah. What happened here? Okay, and then not capable of creating prosperous society. I forget which one I had associated with this. But let's just stay with this for a second. This is just like a few of the things that are born out of the idea that blacks are inferior. And like I said, I have family members. I have uncles that have expressed this many, many different ways. I probably believed this at some point when I was a kid too, just because that's what was taught to me. You have to be honest with yourself that this is what you were taught by people that you may look up to, by people that may be in your family, that this idea is completely bogus because they just got it from somebody else who got it from somebody else. There's no proof of it. What's really
society.
What's really hard about this, about having this idea though within a specific culture, is that no one will admit to this. No one will ever tell you, at least these days, not many people will tell you that black people they don't think black people are as smart. They won't say it to you directly, but every now and then you can pick up on comments, you can pick up on their attitudes. But in the 1950s or even before, maybe in the 1800s, when this system, this hierarchy of value or privilege or capability, right, within a specific group, back then they would tell you very openly, yeah, blacks are inferior. That's why that's why we have them as slaves, and that's what they would use to justify slavery. Actually, that they're inferior. That's how you could rationalize why the Bible, believing in God, being a God-fearing Christian, but yet owning slaves because they're inferior. And so, in today's world, what you end up with is a lot of people that just because they think that they don't believe that black people require tougher enforcement, they'll tell you something like they're not racist. Just because they don't believe that black people are more primitive, they'll tell you they're not racist. But they might still believe that black people are not as smart. They might still believe that black people are not capable of building prosperous societies, because the root of that is still there, and they haven't explored it all the way through to come to terms with the fact that if they harbor this idea, it leads to all these things. Now imagine a police officer who has being indoctrinated in this, and he believes that they're more primitive, that they require tougher enforcement, that their life is somewhere in here is not as meaningful. Maybe that's just part of like being inferior. Right? So not as valuable. It's like, and by the way, some of these things are self-reinforcing. So yeah, you may not believe that black people require tougher enforcement, but then you see them burning down their neighborhood, and then you start thinking that's because they're inferior. That may again allow you to start believing again that maybe they're not as smart. Oh, maybe we do require tougher enforcement for them. This is a cycle. And as long as you have a few of these, you go back to the central point that you still feel like they're inferior. and that's why they need to cooperate with the police. That's why the police needs to be there to protect you from them, predators, as Hillary Clinton said. Here's the crazy thing, though. This one need affirmative action. So a lot of conservatives and Republicans speak out against affirmative action. So they're not necessarily the ones that are saying that blacks need affirmative action. The ones that are saying that blacks need affirmative action are usually the liberals, aren't they? But in a way, those liberals, the fact that they're saying that a group needs affirmative action, they might actually be saying it because they believe that that group is not as smart. Not necessarily because they're saying that the group has had all these disadvantages, that we're just trying to see if we provide a way, a path for them to overcome some of these historical inequities. And so, yeah, so you see a lot of liberals that they're just racist because they want to help for affirmative action, but they're the ones that move to a different neighborhood and they want to live with black people. They're the ones that maybe when, if they're in their car and a black person walks through, they lock their car. Yet they believe in affirmative action. They say they're not racist. So this thing is, it's impossible to prove this because nobody will ever admit to it, and that's what's so hard. But the idea is still in there, and I'm sure you've seen it in your own experience in other people, that that's why it's so complex. That's why when somebody says I'm not racist, or when somebody says racism doesn't exist, almost right away I know that this person is either being disingenuous or they don't think, they don't like to think about it. Because a person that's being honest with you, if you ask them, are you someone that's racist, the best possible answer that somebody can give you is to say, yeah, I grew up with a lot of racist influences. Like, they probably influenced me in that way, but I'm trying to overcome them. Because if they were given to me as a kid, then I'm trying to snap out of them. And that's our experience for a lot of us. And I won't get into how black people themselves can start believing this as well, and how that affects their outcome in certain areas. Because I know that Latinos believe this thing, because there's such a thing as a self-hating Latino that despises Native Americans, yet they look Native American. So they, like, in a way, despise themselves, right? Because they believe this garbage. And by the way, I'm not trying to focus too much here on just black people, or at least let me make it a point to say that, when I say blacks are inferior, we're talking about black people because of what's happening in the country, but this can easily be Native Americans here as well. I was just explaining the hierarchy from Latin America, and focusing on black people because of what's happening.
Yeah, and I think, well, as it relates to race relations and the continent, I think it is, and in some ways, it's black or white, right? And they represent the two extremes. So, and I know that Native people have also suffered a lot. Asian people have also suffered, but in some ways, blacks have gotten the brunt of it, and because of the slavery experience. And I think, as you went over this exercise, I think it's helpful because you do kind of see how there's still a lot of thinking, a lot of thoughts that may not seem racist, but come from a racist understanding of a culture or people. So for me, it's how powerful it is to understand the power of the narrative, and how much of it is really a strategy to dehumanize, in order to pin people against each other, in order to maintain control, in order to rob, rape, and do enforce whatever it is that you need to do to get your society ahead. So there's that piece. But then the other amazing piece is, like, when you look at just contemporary, like, that all of these things are not true, right? Like, black people are all those things. They build great cultures. They are smart. Their life is valuable. There's so many contributions, right? They're they're great musicians, great athletes, great scholars, great all these things. And it's crazy because here in the United States and in Latin America too, right? Like, we dance, we celebrate, we enjoy so many things that are Native American and Native American creations, Native American voices, and yet you still have this idea that they're inferior, right? Like that's the most frustrating thing is, and it's almost like almost in so many ways we now see that this is not true, but people are still kind of clinging to these ideas in part because it's maybe what it was taught to them by their families
Well,
or by society or their or it's part of their identity now, right? It's like they define themselves like, oh, they're bad, so I'm good, or they're this, I'm that. So it's almost like it also believing this has become a part of somebody else's identity too.
Yeah, well, like I said, these are self-reinforcing. That's the problem with this. That people see these things, and a lot of the times they're already looking for something that already fits within their narrative, and they're not even aware of this. They just they'll just see something like this. Let me just finish typing this way. Right. So they'll see something like this, and uh, you said, of course, this something like this is completely ludicrous, because there's so many different factors, man. You don't even just in terms of like somebody's genetic makeup, like it's so preposterous that people actually still believe things like this. And you don't even have to try that hard. Just think, okay, well, if blacks are really inferior, how come the slave owners didn't want to teach them how to read and write? Right?
Yeah.
If they believe that, if you don't believe that they're capable of much, then give them an education. They would have made better slaves if you would have given them an education, because you would have been able to at least maybe communicate with them better. Oh, no, no, they didn't give them an education because they knew what they were capable of. If you give any human an education. But people see things like even when they think about not being able to create a prosperous society, of course, there's like countries in Africa that are more prosperous now, especially with China coming in and helping. But they don't talk about all of these external factors that may have exploited um, Africa for so long and pillaged it and
Yeah.
left it in like utter ruin for it's gonna take decades or generations to recover. Like it's so frustrating sometimes to see how these things are so self-reinforcing, because the people, they're not, they at least they choose not to think about it, or they don't know how to think about it, or nobody's ever told them. It's just easy. It's such an easy explanation to say, okay, well, black people need affirmative action because they're not as smart. Oh, they require tougher enforcement because they're more primitive. Yeah, because they're inferior. That's such a simple, it's so simple, such a simple answer, but that's what people go to a lot of the times. And when I was in college, when we were at Brown, a computer science department, I remember we had an assignment, and it was another Latino kid freshman year. It was a few of us, like maybe two of us, and then was a few black kids. And I ended up picking up my roommate was we were both taking computer science, so we were in the SciLab, or in the computer science lab once, and we were working on an assignment, and the other Latino student was there too. But because I had my roommate, and we used to discuss ideas, and then we used to go over the results of tests and everything, and so we used to help each other. Um, we were doing an assignment, and we were just coding. We were there, and then it was another Latino that was struggling a little bit, and this other Indian kid who was a little bit sharper, or at least he knew a little bit more. Maybe he had been doing computer science for a while. He, like, in front of us, he asked him. He was like, "Hey man, why are you even here?" Because the kid was struggling, right?
Oh my God.
The kid was struggling, and then the Indian guy pretty much said, "Why are you even here? Are you here because of affirmative action?" And see, that those type of comments that other people will never experience, those are the type of comments that tell you that even today, because this was, well, 20 years ago, but these were still, modern times in 2000. Even today, that's how people still feel deep down inside. And it doesn't matter if you're white or Asian or Native American, not Native American, or Indian, or even Latino. That's how a lot of people feel about black people, or even Latinos. And so ask anyone, though. Ask anyone if this is how they feel, and they'll say no, because people are full of BS. people aren't even capable of telling you the truth. Sometimes they're just being dishonest and they don't tell you the truth. Sometimes they don't even realize that that's how they feel, and so they get defensive. And that's what's even scarier, right? That people don't even realize that this is what's going on in their head, and so therefore when you ask them, they'll say, "Oh yeah, like of course not. I don't believe in any of this stuff." That this right here, this is systemic racism. This is racism. You can't quantify it. There's no test that you can make, that you can ask people that will show you that this is true. All we have is the after effects of a society that is run with this idea, with people walking around with this idea in their head. All we have is the statistics, or what we can try to look at statistics at the outcomes as the consequences of this. And we see them in the police brutality. We see them in employers not calling black people because of their name sounds black. We see that in the banks not lending to them for a number of reasons. Maybe they're dangerous. They're going to bring down property value, whatever, right? These are the things that lead to the consequences. And then all of these people that are studying the statistics, that are studying the results, all they're doing is studying the outcome. And so they're looking at the outcome and they're trying to figure out, well, what is it? Do cops kill more black people than white? Oh, maybe they do, maybe they don't. And then depending on how the data is gathered, they can come up with all these conclusions. Just look at this thing right here. It's so simple. If people were honest with themselves, can anybody honestly say that if a particular group of people is considered to be inferior, that everything else, that their experience in life will be the same as somebody else that doesn't have that burden, right? Mm-hmm. And what's crazy, even when I was at Bloomberg, me and another Indian guy, he was pretty cool. We were interviewing for positions in our department. And we went through like 20 or 30 different people that we were interviewing. And we interviewed one black guy. And
wow.
And he was interviewing for computer science. There's not many in computer science. And we were asking him the questions that we ask everyone else. He was doing pretty good. He was answering some questions. In other areas he was struggling. But we or at least my interviewing style is, I was asking him follow-up questions. Like, even though he didn't know something, I was asking him like follow-up questions to see if I could give him some hints and to arrive at it. And he was actually coming along. I would ask him a question a different way, and he would answer it, and then make a little progress in that. And then I would ask him another question. And so from what I was seeing from this candidate was that I liked his thinking process, because I would ask him a question or give him a hint, and he would be able to come up to some
figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Figure at least like the next step. And then so I like that, because that shows you how someone's thinking when they're problem solving skills. And me and the Indian guy were doing this. So in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, I could see myself like working with this guy. I think he would be a pretty good contributor. But as I'm thinking this, and as we're interviewing with him, like, he looked at us, at both of us, and he just stopped. He stopped in the middle of the interview, and he said, "Look, guys, let's just be honest here. You guys are not going to hire me because you guys don't think that I can do this." And dude, when he said that, I was shocked, because I mean, I try to tell him, it's like, no, we're just asking you questions because that's what we do. And he's like, no, it's okay. You don't have to play it off. It's okay, man. I'll walk myself out. And he left. Dude, I don't know if that's because he had internalized all this stuff, or he was just tired of people treating him like that, treating him like he's inferior. Those are the consequences of thinking like this. And I wish that they would teach this stuff in elementary school, middle school. They don't teach kids any of this stuff. Sometimes teachers want to pretend like we don't have racism. Like, people make the claim that because Obama's president, now racism is over. Dude, it's so ludicrous, right? Sometimes just hearing people talk.
Yeah, and staying on the sample, that example, like, what was your colleague's reaction?
Yeah, he was pretty surprised too, because we discussed it afterwards, and I said, "Hey, man, I thought this guy was doing pretty good," and he was like, "Yeah, he was fine." And then I even said, "Man, should we go get him?" But then, like, he had already walked out. It was weird. Like, I thought about going back to get him, but at the end, we're like, I didn't go, because you go outside, you go down the elevator. It would have just been hard, because it just feel really weird because I feel like if I was gonna try to salvage this and try to put him at ease, it should have been right then and there when he initially told us. But he was able to essentially um, like control. He was able to control the narrative. He was like, "Don't even try, man. Don't bother. I already know. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I'm out of here." And then he just
Yeah.
got up and left. So I couldn't. It was really hard to say no, no, no. I mean, just like it was hard to take control again of the situation. Partly because I was young. I was 20. I was in my early 20s,
Yeah.
and it's just part of the learning experience. But like, again, that's an experience that stays with me.
Yeah, and it's sad, and you feel sad for that person that they got to that level that they didn't think that they were gonna make it. And who knows? Obviously, I'm sure it was a competitive position, but who knows? Maybe if he would have stuck with it, maybe he could have been made the offer, grown in. But who knows? Maybe he ended up in a position that was in a profession that was better. But yeah, it just sucks because it really eats at your self-esteem and your
Hmm.
self-love. So I
Yeah.
think that that's what I feel like right now is so important for us to like tell our African American brothers and sisters that we love them, that their lives do matter, um, and that we need to step up and be there for them. And I think to your point that yeah, I mean this stuff is still being enforced. So I think it's not simple. It's not just as easy as to say I'm not a racist. I think you got to go a step further and you got to be an anti-racist. And I know that was a really good book that I read by How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi.
Hmm.
And I think he talks about his own experience and he uses his own experience, his own growth as an African American male to 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 break down some of the ideas and concepts that you just talked about, which are also incorporated by the oppressed, right? So the whole colorism within African American and Latino culture, also Asian culture, all these things that you absorb and that get indoctrinated in you, and that you got to actively got to fight. And when somebody makes a comment, oh, that's because they're negrito or because they're indiecito or because they look this way, then you got to like actively say no, this is why, this is, oh, that's interesting, why do you think that, so you think this, and you start asking questions. And now obviously there's things at the systematic system level that need to be addressed, but I think that this is part of the process that we need to go through, just like we did in the 19 in the six yeah in the 1960s, how we did in the 1860s with the world with the I mean I'm sorry, with the Civil War and all these things. I think that this is hopefully another step in our evolution as a country, as a society, where we step up and become anti-racist.
Yeah, I agree with you. And like I said, it's a very gradual process because it just takes time.
Hmm.
Like, people don't. It's really hard for people to change from, because most people, for the most part, they're having a conversation with themselves in their head. And if all you do is talk to yourself, then you're always right,
Hmm.
right? Even if you try to take the devil's advocate in your head, you always end up in some consensus. You never really have, um, you never really, right? Are you, maybe you're at odds with yourself, but usually you end up with some resolution. It's not the same as engaging and interacting with other people where you have to defend ideas and you get challenged and
And you
your way
become
of,
self-aware too, right?
yeah,
Like
and
in
your way of
explaining
thinking.
yourself, you kind of break
Yeah,
down
I've
some
always,
biases.
yeah, I've always said that with the exception of sociopaths, because those are maybe a little bit more difficult to understand, but with the exception of sociopaths, if you as an individual can come to terms with who you are and you can understand who you are, it's not very hard to understand other people, even if they're being racist, even if they're being specific ways, because you should be able to see most of those behaviors, you should be able to have seen them in yourself at some point. Hypocrisy, um, anger, fear, double standards. Like we all have them. And even I try to tell people all the time, like, look, man, go easy on go easy, go, don't not necessarily go easy, but you have, like, when somebody's confronting a white person and all they're doing is accusing them of being racist, it's like, look, you have to learn to try to communicate that message slightly different, because this generation of white people, they're so detached from the years from the 60s, that at least the young kids, right, the ones that still have harbored these ideas, they're so detached from slavery, they're so detached from a lot of these things. And so, because they haven't lived those experiences also, as being from a different race, it's so hard for them to like empathize with the struggle of like blacks or Latinos, and the challenges that we see. But their inability to empathize is no different than a man's inability to empathize with a woman sometimes, because you still have a lot of sexism,
Hmm.
right? So don't make it seem like it's white people that have a special type of like mental disability because of racism. It's just racism is one idea. Racism is one idea that gets bundled up, and that they fall victim to because it's a system. It's an idea that was brought over by the colonizers and slash invaders from Europe, and they're the ones that get called out for not being able to overcome this idea that is at this point now, like, it's an anachronism. It's no long it no longer fits our society. We shouldn't have these like lingering things from the past still with us, but yet a lot of people do. And but don't right, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. It's not unique to them. Men have these same ideas. Like, take any idea, the idea of a woman's role in a relationship, the idea of gay people, the idea of transgender people, like
Hmm.
whatever idea that is. If you try to get to the root of it, like right here we have the root idea that blacks are inferior. Try to look for another root idea, like gay people are XYZ, whatever that idea is. And now look at all the people that struggle with coming to terms with having gay people in our society, because they don't know how to deal with that idea. They don't know how to break it apart and understand that they need to overcome that. That's no different than a white person not being able to to um, to tame or to come to terms with the idea of racism. So
Yeah.
so we all do it. It's just a matter of what ideas it is that we're doing.
What?
Which ideas are we applying it to?
No, that's good, and I think it's not just white people. I think is
Of course.
light skinned Latinos and others, Asian Americans, everybody who. And you make a good point because it is fundamentally about our shared humanity and the realization that we are human, that we're very similar, and that the more that we are can understand who you are, where you come from, your experience, and appreciate that other people have been hurt similarly, but then work towards to making a society, a family where people are loved and accepted. And maybe initially you don't understand, oh, my son is gay. Oh crap, like this is not what I wanted. Like, well, how do you fight that and say, okay, you know what? I still love him. I still want him to be happy, and all those things. So I know that to your point, it is a process of self growth, of helping people grow in that way, and I think it's growing as individuals and growing as a society. So I think that's part of what we're doing now too. Like we're have this incredible opportunity to go, to let this impact you, to process it, to think about your privilege, to challenge those ideas that maybe you still Harvard and but still like grow and think and become a better person and challenge. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel this way about the riots? Could it be more that there's instigators? or even if they did riot and they did cause all this damage, how do we move forward? How do I do what I need to do to build a more just society? So I think so much I do feel that so many things that are expresses themselves in society is things that we need to process individually, and then our culture kind of catches up, and then we start embracing new concepts and new deeper understandings and appreciations for our differences, right? Because I think that's the beautiful thing when you grow up in a diverse community. People know who you are. They learn a little bit more about your experience. You learn about them, and now that Indian person, that black person, that Chinese person, that Filipino person is not just a Chinese name. It's a person, and someone who you understand, who you can relate to, who you had a great time with. And it also happens with the white friends and the white people that you develop, that you just appreciate that you find people that you connect with, and that yeah, that it just treat people as people.
We'll treat them like how you would want to be treated, but
Exactly.
actually do it. I think a lot of these things, like I said earlier, I am hopeful that a lot of these things will gradually resolve themselves. The more, you see, the more social media, that's one of the huge benefits of it. That now people are more connected to each other. They're interacting more. The world's becoming globalized. So the number one thing that breaks down these barriers is to interact with the other people, to
Hmm.
understand that if you have a whole bunch of black friends, you're gonna find some incredibly smart ones. You're gonna find some average ones. You're gonna find some stupid guys. But that's you're gonna find that everywhere. You're gonna be like, wait a minute, it's just like us. We have some like really smart Latinos, some okay ones, and like some really dumb people.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm using dumb in like a like tongue in cheek. That's very
Mm.
subjective as to how you define that. But that's the way that people learn about each other. Like they have to interact with each other in order to bring these barriers down. If they're not interacting with each other, then they're just left with the stereotypes that they have. And so
Hmm.
I am optimistic for that. Also, I'm optimistic that there's a lot of development going on in Africa. There's a lot of development from China and these African countries. I think in the next 50 or so years, maybe more, they're gonna see a huge improvement in the quality of life in terms of the things that are gonna start coming out of there as they start becoming like second world, third world countries and more modernized. And then you start seeing the true potential of people from Africa, and then in the United States too, right? The more opportunity there is for an education, the more level the playing field is, the more you start seeing African American intellectuals that go into other industries that start shattering this like low IQ, not as smart part of the racism tree. And there'll still be others, but it one at a time, one of those dominoes is gonna
Yeah.
fall. And so yeah, that would be good. People will start, yeah, people will start at least looking beyond this, because man, it must be exhausting to have your thought process completely overtaken by something as nonsensical as racism. Imagine if you're a racist and you getting upset and you get pissed off and you spend your time, or even if like, so that's the toll that it takes on the racist, but there's also the toll that it takes on the victims of that. Imagine how much time has to be wasted with this type of stuff,
Yeah.
when you can be devoting that time to so many other things that are more important, to art, to reading, to poetry, to hobbies, whatever. And
To
so that's,
yourself.
yeah, to yourself. That's why I always when I talk to people, I always try to encourage them to be honest with themselves. It's like a very cliche statement, because it's practically meaningless these days, because I don't think people really understand. But I try to talk to people to say, no, look, you need to be honest, like really, really honest about who you are. Because once you understand who you are, you can understand most other people. And it's pretty liberating in a way to
Hmm.
be able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're getting to the part of agency and self-realization. And I think that what we talked about, all of the systematic and things that African Americans and other oppressed minorities have going on them. Also thinking about all of the great cultural resistance, the way that they've been able to adapt, survive, and thrive, and continue to advance and really challenge racism. And I think the sample that we haven't about yet is the of that incident in Central Park, right, where it happened the same day, if I'm not mistaken, as the death of George Floyd. But it was like the it was put in that racism, that narrative of here's a black man attacking a white woman and challenging that and putting it on video and displaying that, and then you got this awful situation. So I'm almost it's crazy to me that those incidents happen at the same time, because if it was only that incident in the park, it would have been, I think it would have been a different conversation, right? Maybe not as intense, not as violent, but then later that day, the incident with George Floyd happened, and I think maybe it's what we just needed to see, right? I think uh, just in one day, see the side of progress, and also see the okay, yeah, we still have a lot of more work to do to have a fair, more equal, more diverse society, more tolerant society.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. You think we should wrap it up here, or do we? Is there anything else that we need to cover?
No, I think we got a lot of good points today. Thank you for trying out this new visual technique of the tree. Before you know it, it's gonna be like 3D animations. It's gonna be like Animal Farm.
Well, if I get
You
my Photoshop, if I get Photoshop, I'll do Photoshop next time. It's a little better, but do more a little color coding or some Venn diagrams as well. But yeah, we'll give this a try. See, hopefully it helps. If it's, whoever's listening or watching, if at some point if it helps to visualize how complex these issues are. They're not simple. That if they were simple, we would have already solved them. This is like, if you can recall back to algebra, you could solve an equation with two variables when you knew what one of the variables was. But once you start introducing more variables, even just three variables is pretty hard for most people. Imagine a
Mhm.
problem with like 10 or 20 variables. It's almost impossible for humans to solve those problems. We just don't think, we don't have the tools to do that. And that's what these problems are. They're problems with many variables. And sometimes people try to like fix as many variables as they can to solve for one variable, but that misses the whole point. You fixed like 90% of the variables, made an assumption about what their value is, and then you solve for one. That doesn't solve the problem. You just like solve like a small segment of it. But anyway, yeah, I think, any closing words?
No, thank you. Thank you for engaging in this dialogue and for having this conversation with me.
All right, likewise. We'll meet up again next week. See you.
Sounds good.